Good.
How you doing?
Good morning.
Good.
I'm very pleased to present David Shearer, the Secretary General Special Representative for South Sudan and head of the UN mission there. He just spoke to the Security Council a little while ago. Mr. Shearer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just make a few comments about what I said to the Security Council and just some follow-up points, and then I'm free to take your questions. I think what I did say was on the peace process that there's over the last few days, particularly with what's happened with regard to the high-level meeting on South Sudan and the African Union meeting on South Sudan, that there is a renewed enthusiasm and solidarity for the peace process. This revitalisation forum that it's called is designed to revitalise the peace process under the leadership of IGAD, the East African Community of States, particularly led by Ethiopia. The question now is, while everybody's behind the process and moving forward, there's a need to move urgently towards providing substance to that process, and a number of the issues about how we move forward, the timeline going forward, who is involved in the peace process, given that before the process was very bipolar between the two, Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir. Now there's a number of other actors involved in that as well. So I feel much more optimistic about moving forward than I did before coming here at the beginning of last week. Just on the general situation in South Sudan, it remains dire. Still, around more than 6 million people require assistance. In general, the humanitarian workers that have been involved have done a remarkable job in getting to the great majority of locations across South Sudan, but on occasion, often at critical times and in critical areas, the access is denied, and that's something we're working with mainly with the government on, but also with opposition groups as well. As I said to the council, the opposition in many respects now is more splintered and more fractured than what it was before. That presents some challenges, obviously, going forward with the peace process, but it also presents challenges with regard to the humanitarian situation. The World Food Programme, for example, now requires 13 permissions from armed groups when they want to travel from between Juba and Yambio in the southwestern corner of the country. And that's quite significant in terms of being able to get those permissions. And an ICRC driver was killed exactly 2 weeks ago when he was hit by bullets from one of the factions, one of the groups along that particular road. And I suspect that what we're going to see is more of that type of situation where rebel groups are resorting to criminality in order to survive and then becoming rebels again. So that sort of shifting type of allegiance is going to be, I think, a feature of the future. Just in terms of the UN and just in conclusion, our role, the United Nations peacekeeping force there is in 17 different locations across the country. We're protecting 220,000 people inside or immediately adjacent to our bases. But in addition to that, we're pushing out, and they encourage our forces to push out more robustly, in a more nimble and proactive way than they have been in the past. And that's been bearing fruit in terms of being able to get to places before we have problems and troubles. The RPF, the Regional Protection Force, that is mandated to come in support of the mission. It'll be absorbed into the mission ultimately. It's not a separate force as such. It's a part of UNMISS. About 650 troops of that 4,000 are in now, and we're expecting in the next month or so the balance of the Rwandan troops, so that'll be another 700 or 800 troops, and the first reconnaissance company from an Ethiopian battalion that'll come in the next 2 weeks. It's due to arrive in the next 2 weeks, and there the rest of the battalion will follow on from there. So as these forces come in, they were originally down to protect Juba, and we're going to make sure that of course happens. But because of the insecurity, particularly in the south, we're looking at being able to use those additional forces to be able to project more into the equatorial region of the south, where there's been a lot of violence, a lot of human rights abuses, and where more than 1 million people have fled the country into Uganda. By having a stronger presence there, we're hoping to help prevent some of those atrocities from occurring, but also provide an environment where people ultimately might feel safe enough to come back into the country and resume their lives. So let me just leave. That's a very, very, very brief overview, but I'm very happy to take your questions as we go along.
Thanks. I'll open up the floor. I'll now open up the floor for questions. If you can please introduce yourself to our speakers when you ask your question. Sherwin.
Mr. Shearer, Sherwin Bryce-P, South African Broadcasting, on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thank you for this press briefing. It's good to see you. Could you talk a bit about what you said in the Council regarding the Regional Protection Force? Quote, while the government has officially repeated its acceptance of the RPF and UNMISS has closely adhered to the government's clearances and protocols, the positioning of RPF troops in relation to Juba Airport, including at the mission's Tomping base, remains a vexed issue. What are you referring to? And then, in addition, could you talk a bit about the conditions in these protection sites? I mean, it's been how long? 2 years almost?
Really 4 for some.
4 years.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the conditions like for the over 200,000 people that are housed there?
Yeah, sure. First of all, on the RPF, I mean, the government has particular sensitivities around the basing of the RPF in Tomping, and our Tomping base is immediately adjacent to the airport. It's part of the Security Council mandate that we protect strategic sites, and it actually identifies the airport as being one of those strategic sites. We recognise and acknowledge, that the government has, issues around the running and the sovereignty of the airport, and we're not in any way challenging that. That's not our. Everybody that comes and goes out of South Sudan does legally through the airport with a visa, and with all the appropriate permissions. But we've got to be sensitive to the fact that the government does feel its own sensitivities to the airport, and so what we're doing is working through with the government on how to do that and how to base our forces. We already have forces in Tomping. It's not like it's a new thing. It's just the additional RPF forces that is the issue. On the POC sites, I have never been in my entire career with the UN and beyond into a refugee camp or an IDP camp or a POC camp where it's been pleasant. And POC camps, believe me, they are literally about 60 metres away from my accommodation and in UN House. I mean, they're that close to our bases. And when it pours with rain during the rainy season, you listen and you think, those poor people who are sitting under plastic sheeting right now, this is not going to be very pleasant for them. However, they are sites that are established to protect people, and they are there because they need physical protection, and our forces are there patrolling and providing that physical protection. We also take very strong measures to make sure that they remain civilian and they don't sort of gravitate into being havens for combatants. That is something we have a zero tolerance towards, and anybody that's we identify as being a combatant or somebody who's involved in a criminal act, they get ejected immediately straight out of our bases. So we must protect their civilian nature. That's the reason that we can provide that sort of security. It's partly our security forces, but it's partly because the POC camps themselves don't pose a threat to anybody. And we're adamant that that's going to remain the case, because we've got women and children and old people and all these others that we're trying to protect, who rely on us, or rely on the fact that this is a non-threatening environment.
Maggie.
Margaret Bashir, Voice of America. Welcome, Mr. Shearer.
Thank you.
Last month, Mr. Haysom spoke about concerns about the elections, saying they could push the country into deeper conflict if serious issues aren't resolved. President Mogai mentioned the election concerns again this morning. Can you give us your perspective on whether the country can hold elections and the state of affairs going into this phase?
Yeah, and I mentioned it in my statement as well. I think our feeling is that right at the moment, 1/3 of the population in South Sudan, that's about 4 million people out of 12 million people, are displaced either internally or externally. And there's obviously conflict in many parts of South Sudan, various types of conflict. Our feeling very much is that an election should consolidate a peace process, that we need to have elections that can be free and fair, and most importantly, inclusive. And so looking at the way in which looking at the conditions on the ground, we want to make sure that the conditions are conducive to holding elections, so that people can, as in any other country, be able to register their democratic right. If many people are excluded from that, then it could have very detrimental impact on the way that they see the process moving forward. If they miss out on that ability to vote, and therefore accept the leadership that comes from the electoral process. So we believe it's very important that we have that the elections go ahead in an environment that is free, fair, and able to be inclusive. And for that reason, we're looking at the moment and working with the government on that to say, let's bring our expertise as the United Nations and talk with you about what we would like to see in the way of a conducive environment.
Mr. Shearer, I'm Carol Landry with AFP, Agence France Presse. I have two questions. The first one, what impact do you think Nikki Haley's visit to South Sudan will have? And the second one is, you talked about the complications of launching the revitalization forum and the participants. Is Riek Machar a participant in this, and who is so far?
Okay. Well, first of all, with Ambassador Haley, I mean, we welcome her into South Sudan, and it's really good that she's making that trip to get a first-hand impression of what the situation is like on the ground. I mean, if there's nothing beats being there and understanding and talking to people to give you a really good understanding. So I think that's it's very encouraging that she's coming, and we certainly will be doing whatever we can to support that visit, as we would with anybody coming from the Security Council. Just on the on your question about revitalisation, the issue of the revitalisation is being led by the regional countries as under EGAD, and they're being supported by the African Union. And the African Union released a statement last week that was very strong, perhaps stronger than we'd seen before, which is encouraging. And obviously the United Nations will support, be supporting them as well. So, but it's very much their lead, and so their decision about who participates is EGAD's decision. Having said that, what they are trying, my understanding is that participation will be as open and as wide as possible. On the question of Riek Machar at the moment, and this might change, at the moment they're looking at the initial discussions, including his constituency, but not necessarily him in person. But again, that's their decision, and that might change as the process goes along. We just have to see how things work out.
George?
Thank you. George Baumgarten, Africa Connect Online. About 2 years ago, we were told, I think by one of your predecessors in the same position, the conflict that is going on within South Sudan is essentially a conflict within the SPLA between the president and the then Vice President, Mr. Machar. What is the status of that now? And who is really fighting whom, and what are their objectives? And just incidentally, is the oil getting pumped down there? And is the country have some economy running? And have there been any I don't want to say invasions? Have been any incursions on the part of the shall we say North Sudanese?
Okay, there's quite a lot of stuff there. From the point of view of from Sudan, I mean, we've seen very little, certainly no over the border. The border is disputed, let's just put it first of all that way, but no incursions into the greater part of South Sudan. And we haven't seen any evidence of major resupply of ammunition or weapons or anything like that. There might be some that trickles across, but we haven't seen, any sort of substantial shipments. What the Sudanese have done, which I have to say compliment them on, and that's been incredibly helpful, is they've opened up routes, corridors for humanitarian supplies to come from Sudan into the north of South Sudan. That's been very useful. And they also, of course, have taken carried a big burden of refugees that have come out of South Sudan and into Sudan. So that's our kind of reading of things. On the oil, I'm working backwards in your questions here. And on the oil situation, there's two main oil fields. One of them shut down 2 or 3 years ago in Unity State, and because of the fighting, and hasn't reopened. The other one in Upper Nile, and also in the north of the country, is working, and that is providing probably about 95% of the revenue of the government. But the economic situation is very bad. There's about 165% inflation at the moment. Just to give you an idea, when I came into South Sudan in January, the South Sudanese pound was buying about $1 was worth about 100 South Sudanese pounds, and today it's 170. So that's in the space of 9 months. That's how much the economy, the currency's slid. Now that has a very big impact on people, particularly if they're earning, South Sudanese pounds or trading in South Sudanese pounds. They're watching their money slip away from them. So that's why the inflation rate's obviously so high. So it's the economy is in bad shape, and as I mentioned to the council today, I mean the civil servants haven't been paid for 4 or 5 months, and security forces even for the last 3 months, and that's very worrying for obvious reasons. Just in terms of the fighting, I mean last year the conflict was very much about Riek Machar and his forces, opposition forces, railed against the President Salva Kiir. With Riek Machar's departure, there's been a splintering of the opposition, and so the opposition now lacks the command and control that we would have seen perhaps a year ago, and some of it is broken down into more ethnically defined groups that wasn't so significant or present before. But there's, to be perfectly honest, there's different conflicts happening across South Sudan, and one of the areas that we're most worried about is actually is just conflict amongst and within tribes, and a lot of it's around cattle and various other things. And that's killing many people. Because in the past, these sort of conflicts would be fought with spears and whatever. Now they're being fought with AK-47s, so a number of people end up dying. So what the UNMISS is doing to a large degree is we're doing an enormous amount of reconciliation on the ground, bringing groups together. And while that very seldom gets any sort of press, it's definitely saved hundreds, if not thousands, of people's lives as a result of that.
Evelyn?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Evelyn Leopold, Huffington Post contributor. Recently, there's been another report, this time 65 pages, on how both the president and Maka are looting the place and buying expensive property in Nairobi. Do you have any information about that? And so are some of the military commanders. What are they stealing? The oil money, or?
Look, I can't speak on the specifics of the report because, to be honest, I haven't yet seen it. But this is not a new story, unfortunately. Transparency International put South Sudan one above Somalia, which is the very bottom of the list in terms of transparency and non-corruption. So I think you can probably take your lead from that. It is one of the biggest problems that is actually acknowledged within the leadership of South Sudan as well, the degree to which money is being siphoned off. But we don't follow that on an active basis.
How is it acknowledged amongst the leadership?
In speeches, and I mean, I've heard leaders talk about it and how they, money has been siphoned off, particularly in the past during the CPA, the kind of the transition period. Yeah.
We're running out of time, and I see several hands. How many more questions would you be able to take?
Okay, about another two or three, I think. Maybe another two, because I'm supposed to be seeing my boss, which is probably the most.
Marie and then Joe, and then we'll try and wrap up. Marie?
Hi, Marie for RFI. The government of South Sudan, end of August, has been asking for a review of the mandate of the RPF. I was wondering, where are the discussions now regarding this problem, and do you think you would be able to get those 4,000 people coming?
Well, the mandate is there, and we're working to the mandate. So the only issue around that is really about responding to what the needs are on the ground, and their needs have moved from the standoff in Juba that we had a year ago to the very dire situation in the Equatorias. So there's an acceptance that, while the RPF was designed for a particular thing, at least people understand that we have to respond to the situation on the ground. So them coming in will enable us to move other forces down into areas of significant need. Yeah.
Joe and then
Yes, Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. You mentioned in response to an earlier question about the introduction of more sophisticated weapons that has led to more killings. Could you tell us principally where those arms are coming from, your views on the desirability of an arms embargo being instituted, which has been sought in the past, and in respect to this rapid deployment force, is that what it is?
Regional Protection Force.
Regional Protection Force. Okay, I got the word force in there. Right? Could you give any concrete examples of how that has helped provide more security to the civilians inside the UN bases who were quite vulnerable in the past? Thank you.
I think perhaps more responding to your last question. We've got, as I say, we're at 600 of the 4,000 there already. What's useful about the ones that have come already is that about a third of them are engineers, so they're actually on the roads and rebuilding roads. But also what we have been doing is to not so much protecting the static sites, because we've already got forces to do that, but we're now being able to move down trade routes and other places to be able to, the trading route from between Uganda and Juba, for example, is the main supply route, and we're doing much more patrolling on those places, on those roads where we're seeing a number of attacks against civilian vehicles. So what we will often do is get a patrol running along a road and look behind us, and effectively we will have 30 or 40 trucks that are tagging along with us because they see us as offering them some security in terms of moving forward and getting to where they need to get to. So that's a really important part of our role, is provide more mobile protection rather than static protection, and getting out into communities to enable people to stay where they are rather than to flee into protection sites. I better run now because my boss is going to.
Thanks.
With
Thanks very
respect
much for your
quickly to
time,
the
Mr. Chair.
arms, the issue of the arms.
I mean, the best place to go to that is the. There's a report coming out very soon on the. What is it, Guy? What's Clem's panel of experts report? It should be coming out soon. So they follow that rather than us, and we take all our information from that. Okay,
Thanks very much, Mr.
Okay.
Shearer. Thanks a lot for your
Thank
time.
you very much.
Good
Nice to see you
afternoon,
again.
everyone.
Okay, cheers.